Star Wars: The Book of Boba Fett is created by Jon Favreau and Robert Rodriguez and takes place after the events of The Mandalorian Season 2.
If you had spoken such insolence to Jabba, he'd have fed you to his menagerie.
Please, speak freely.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Don Martino here from XTRACT Media, and today I am prepping for The Mandalorian Season 3 by starting to go through all the live-action Star Wars series that came before. So a couple things to preface this review. Number one, I've never been a major Boba Fett fan, but I loved what they did with the character in The Mandalorian Season 2 in the episode directed by Robert Rodriguez, so I was looking forward to seeing what Robert Rodriguez could do here. Also, I'm a huge fan of Robert Rodriguez in general. I really think the guy's a very talented filmmaker, and I love many of his films. Also, Jon Favreau was going to be involved in the Book of Boba Fett, so I was very excited to see what he can do since he did so well with The Mandalorian. So just as a quick heads up, guys, I'm not going to really make an effort to refrain from spoilers on this one, so if you plan to watch the show, you may want to tune out. It's completely up to you. Or if you haven't seen the show and you just don't care and you just want to know my opinion spoiler-wise before you go into it, that's fine. Just stick around. The first chapter is Stranger in a Strange Land. It's directed by Robert Rodriguez, and after rewatching this episode this time around, there are immediate red flags that I probably should have seen. I hate to say it that way, but it's true. There are these like sort of rushed and messy sort of flashbacks that we get right from the get-go, even though I think what they're showing in the flashback is somewhat integral to understanding the Boba Fett character. It just really flies through those in a weird pace. I found them to be extremely choppily edited, and a lot of the shots with Boba Fett on Tatooine are very ugly. I'm not gonna lie to you. When he's being dragged through the sand, it doesn't look great, and that's surprising coming from a seasoned director like Robert Rodriguez. I really think he didn't direct to standard, but I like that the flashbacks at least like show Boba Fett get out of the Sarlacc pit. It harkens back to Attack of the Clones. It shows young Boba Fett, or the Daniel Logan version of Boba Fett, watching Jango Fett take off in the middle of the night and him not knowing what's going on. I do like what they showed there. Again, it was just sloppily edited. They lead to a monster fight, which I thought was really okay, honestly, and he kind of saves the Tusken Raiders, and then the Tusken Raiders bring him back, and then he's gained their respect and he's no longer kidnapped by him. So it was an okay storyline that they were setting up in the flashback. It was just, like I said, messy. I was also super stoked to just see a mob boss story in Star Wars. I thought that was a really cool area to explore. I love mafia shows and movies, but this one's like almost immediately uncompelling. I mean, there's a big fight scene here when the mayor pretty much sends these guys, these assassins, to come over Boba Fett and Fennec Shand. Tamura Morrison and Ming-Na Wen as Boba Fett and Fennec Shand have great chemistry in the show, and I really like everything with them together, with the exception of this fight scene. The fight scene is very poorly done. It's very poorly edited. The choreography is extremely slow and uncompelling, and it's kind of a drag to get through. The action does pick up quite a bit, though, once Fennec Shand kind of goes through her chase after the two assassins. I thought that worked very well. Ming-Na Wen's doing a lot of her own stunt work, and it looks very good. Chapter 2 is called The Tribes of Tatooine. This episode was directed by Steph Green, and she's new to Star Wars, so I was curious to see what she could do here. It basically continues the events of the first episode when Boba and Fennec go to confront the mayor after the attack from him, but the mayor executes one of the assassins, and you're kind of like, oh shit, I guess maybe the mayor didn't do that. Let me just say too, the mayor's assistant in this show, just no.
Apologies.
God, that guy comes off very cheesy, and he just doesn't belong here. I think overall, Steph Green, though, she does do a pretty serviceable job directing this episode, to be fair. She also had the impossible task of interrupting the story with, hey, another flashback about Boba and the Tuskens. And they did it again while Boba was in a back-to-tank healing. It's just so repetitive. I got very tired of Tatooine after this show, to be honest with you. Everything is in fucking sand.
Like a panther. Yes.
All that said, Steph Green makes the flashback sequences entertaining. She adds some really good humor. There is well-shot action in this episode, but then she also has the impossible task, unfortunately, of setting up this Spice Runner storyline, which is another thing about the show I find to be completely uncompelling. I do like Steph Green's inspiration that she took from Dances with Wolves, with everything going on with the Tusken tribes and all that, and Boba being initiated into the tribe is very good. After Boba's initiation, there's a scene scene where they're all dancing around the fire at the end. I actually found the choreography for the dance to be pretty astounding, very well filmed, and I really like that sequence. Meanwhile, in the present day, though, we are introduced to two Hutts, which I thought was cool. They are clearly relatives of Jabba. They are crime bosses in their own right, and I really like that they're twins. And we're introduced to Black Chrysanthemum, who the Hutts are using to threaten Boba Fett, and I think Black Chrysanthemum is one of the best additions to the show. It was cool to see another Wookiee, but one that's more intimidating and one that's got a look like we've never seen before. And also, Black Chrysanthemum's had a huge presence in a lot of the comic books, so I thought it was cool that they carried him forward here. It was cool to see him brought into live action. Chapter 3 is entitled The Streets of Mos Espa, and this one's directed by Robert Rodriguez. And basically, the plot of this episode is that Boba recruits the street gang out of nowhere, which is kind of random, I will admit. But he's given the street gang the chance to prove themselves and become employees of his and a part of his gang, which I thought was actually kind of cool. I know a lot of people were upset about him just kind of giving them a break because they wanted to see Boba Fett's badassery more than his heart. But the thing is like the Boba Fett that people wanted out of this show, they kind of already got in Din Djarin in The Mandalorian. They're two very similar looking characters, so I understand the temptation to want to distinguish the two. They definitely wanted to give Boba Fett a very different personality than they did Din Djarin, and I really get that. Also, people need to understand Boba Fett is older. It's a common trend in Star Wars fandom that actually is starting to get on my nerves, where fans really do not like their legacy characters getting older and showing age and things of that nature. But to me, it's like a natural part of life, and we have to accept that with age, these characters are going to evolve into something new. I know a lot of people don't like this episode. I don't think it's really that bad. Action-wise, I think it's the best directing Robert Rodriguez does in this entire series. There's fun Star Wars action with some American graffiti influence. I know a lot of people didn't like the Mos Espa Vespas from the street gang, but I got what they were going for and it didn't bother me that much, and I had fun watching the action sequence. We also get a moment where Black Chrysanthemum attacks Boba while he's in the Bacta tank, having yet another flashback. Big surprise. But at least this flashback was extremely integral. It does show the Tusken Raider tribe pretty much getting destroyed by the Spice Runners, which I was like, okay, I guess that's setting up the villains, even though, again, I find Spice Runners to be a very uncompelling antagonist for this show, believe me. And about here, I was really getting the sense that they really just should have put all the flashback sequences together and then gotten into present day, and maybe they would have had more time to flesh out present day. I don't know. But the street gang does come. They intervene when Black Chrysanthemum is trying to attack Boba Fett, and they do prove themselves to be worthy. Overall, the street gang does need a lot more character development in this entire series. They don't get a lot of it, but there are a couple of standout members here that were at least charismatic enough for me to like watching them. Sophie Thatcher as Drash is a real charismatic presence. She has a lot to do in this show compared to the rest of the street gang, and I really liked her whole performance here and what she was bringing to the screen in terms of her presence. The same goes for Jordan Bolger as Scat. I thought he was a real likable presence too, and I'm very interested in his whole eye ordeal and how all that happened. And those two characters are just very likable, but I did want more development for sure. Danny Trejo shows up in this episode, by the way. After the Hutts apologize, they want to give Boba Fett a gift, and they end up giving him a Rancor to put into Jabba's palace, or really his palace now. And I like Danny Trejo's presence in here. It made a lot of sense, honestly. Danny Trejo and Robert Rodriguez are longtime collaborators. Danny Trejo shows up in most Robert Rodriguez projects, so I wasn't very surprised by his presence. And I thought he did fine for the small amount that he had to do. Obviously, though, Boba Fett's trying to prep for this war over the spice, and again, I just find this to be uncompelling, but in doing so, he decides he wants to ride the Rancor, and Danny Trejo shows him how, I guess. Like I said, I think this episode is fun, but the problem is it's mostly throwaway. I mean, the action sequence that I did have fun with, you don't really need it in the show, but it was just a breath of fresh air to get like this really fun action sequence in here, and one that felt very Star Wars. Chapter 4 is called The Gathering Storm. It's directed by Kevin Tancarowan. I apologize if I'm butchering that name. He is also a very new director to Star Wars. I was very unfamiliar with his work, but I was curious to see what he could do here, obviously. And I gotta say, Chapter 4 is the best directed episode at this point in the show. Obviously, it's all flashback, which is kind of overwhelming, at least for the most part. It's all flashback, but it pretty much shows what happened after the events of The Mandalorian Chapter 5. Boba Fett finds Fennec's dead body, it really does develop these two characters and show you how they got together and became a team. Although I'm not a big fan of people just being resurrected by robotic parts. It felt a little easy, in that sequence where the guy's putting the robotic parts into Fennec Shan felt very off for Star Wars, and maybe a little too Robert Rodriguez for Star Wars, if that makes sense. It's very Robert Rodriguez of Kevin Tank Carowan to do here. I just don't like it, but I have to accept that it's a thing. It's in Star Wars canon now, I guess, so I'll move on from that. But the idea of like Boba Fett going back to find his suit from the Sarlacc pit, him and Fennec's relationship there, Boba going off to square all of his debts, it provides some very well-directed action, and action that I found to be a lot of fun, because these two characters are a lot of fun in the action, and Kevin just directs the hell out of these scenes. Honestly, these are some of the best action sequences in the entire series, and these felt incredibly Star Wars to me, and I really like that. This episode includes a seismic charge as well. Seismic charges are awesome. They are still one of my favorite sounds in Star Wars ever since Attack of the Clones. But again, meanwhile, in present day, Boba's still prepping for this damn spice war, and this feels like this story just very much drags at this point. This is why it's so uncompelling. He's getting his gang together, but he still doesn't think they're going to be enough. He admits to Fennec that he's going to need more help, and Fennec says he can get the help if he knows where to look, and then they play the Mandalorian music, which obviously teases that Din Djarin will be showing up in the next episode. And of course, Chapter 5 is called The Return of the Mandalorian, and this is directed by my new favorite Star Wars director, Bryce Dallas Howard, or at least one of my new favorite Star Wars directors. This is the best episode in the whole series, and Bryce Dallas Howard takes after her father Ron Howard because she really directs the hell out of this episode. Obviously, her work has been great in the past with the Mandalorian episodes that she did, but this is her best work to date in Star Wars, and this really allowed her to prove herself as a filmmaker. When Mandalorian comes in and does his job, showing that he's a bounty hunter again and he's wielding that darksaber, I love the way it's performed because he doesn't quite have a hang of the darksaber yet. I thought that stuff was amazing, and the scene is super badass. I mean, he cuts a guy in half. It's all kind of a reminder of how great the character is and how iconic Pedro Pascal's performance has made the character, and he is just such a breath of fresh air when he comes into the show. When he goes to collect his bounty, it's amazing, this scene in the elevator. He goes up the elevator, he opens up the elevator, there's this music playing, he goes up, he gets his bounty, he goes back to the elevator doors close, the music kind of fades and is sort of in the background again, and it's all just done in one continuous shot. There's no cutting here. It's incredible the way this sequence is done. Also, the whole setting and the environment of this planet that he's on is amazing. It kind of reminds me of Halo a little bit, but it's very cool and unique to Star Wars. I love it. So after Din Djarin gets off the elevator, he is wounded, but he does go to meet the armorer, and he's going to train with her to learn how to use the darksaber. Amongst this episode, we also get a lot more backstory about Bo-Katan and her time with the darksaber and ruling Mandalore and what that was like. And we find out that she essentially failed. I found this storyline to be incredibly compelling. We get some awesome flashback sequences that are so artistic and incredibly well directed from Bryce Dallas Howard here. We get fantastic darksaber combat with him and Paz Vizsla here. They kind of go up against each other for the darksaber. Of course, Din Djarin wins this battle, but then he reveals to the armorer that he did take off his helmet. But then Mando travels over to Tatooine. He meets Peli Motto there again, as we see many times when he goes to Tatooine, but this time he's building an N1 starfighter, which is the coolest ship from Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and I love seeing it back here. And then we get a sequence that's just so reminiscent of the pod racing. It's fantastic. This episode is amazing. Once he gets back with the starfighter, Fennec then meets Din Djarin at the landing pad and asks if he can help Boba Fett with this war against the Spice Runners, essentially. And I like that Din Djarin remembers everything that Boba Fett had done for him, and he said, just tell him it's on the house, I'll come help. But first, he's gonna go see Grogu, and that kind of sets up where the next episode is going. So like I said, this is easily the best episode of the series, 100%. The problem is there's no Boba Fett. And I find that to be odd that the best episode in the series is the one without the main character. And it really makes me feel like at the end of the day, Jon Favreau and Robert Rodriguez just didn't have any great compelling ideas to do with this character, but they wanted to fill the time. They wanted to do something small scale that they could shoot during COVID so they could have something as an alternative to The Mandalorian Season 3. 3. And I really hope they learn their lesson in the future to just not rush something and do something just because. Chapter 6 of the show is called From the Desert Comes a Stranger. This one's directed by Dave Filoni. If you don't know who Dave Filoni is, you're just not keeping up with Star Wars anyway, and he is pretty much the man. Like, he's the guy everybody's looking to right now to make great Star Wars and be a great storyteller. His live action directing definitely needs some work, but he is one of the better live action directors working on these shows for sure. And I like this episode. It's a great episode that catches up with Grogu and is training with Luke Skywalker, and Luke Skywalker is back. Mark Hamill is back to reprise his role as Luke as well. The deepfake that they used to de-age him or whatever, I mean, that stuff looks really good in this episode. It's almost flawless at this point. They did a fantastic job with that. I do think the voice performance, kind of de-aging the voice, that needs a little work yet, but I really liked it still. It was still buyable, and it did sound like Luke. And R2-D2's in this episode. He greets Din Djarin as he arrives on this planet where Grogu is training with Luke, and then R2 takes him to a spot where he will eventually meet Ahsoka Tano, and Rosario Dawson is back, reprising the role in this episode, and man, do I love her as Ahsoka. And we get conversations with my two favorite Star Wars characters, Luke Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano, where she's telling him that the Mandalorian came to see Grogu. I love these sequences. This is fantastic stuff. But because Luke Skywalker senses that the attachment could be a distraction, he wants to give Grogu a choice. Take Yoda's lightsaber and take up that mantle, or take the thing that Din Djarin was giving him, which is Beskar armor for him. And they really leave the audience hanging with this choice. And Din Djarin obviously then goes back over to Boba Fett to help him out as promised. And then we get a major reveal at the end of this episode as Cad Bane shows up, and he is the leader of this whole spice operation. It's kind of crazy cool. I was happy they utilized him at all. The way they used him actually did make a lot of sense, even though I don't like these guys as antagonists. Cad Bane is pretty cool. It's something that the fans of the Clone Wars will very much appreciate, myself included. I love that character. It was cool to see him in live action. Timothy Olyphant is also back in this episode as Cobb Vanth, and then him and Cad Bane get into this like Western style shootout, and Cad Bane clearly wins this one as he shoots down Cobb Vanth. Chapter 7 is called In the Name of Honor. It is the big battle episode. It's directed by Robert Rodriguez himself once again, and this episode is not very compelling at all. Look, I'm glad it all kind of came down to a big battle and everything, but the mediocre cinematography just does not do it justice. The action sequences are just shot very mediocre. They're choreographed very mediocre. It feels very bland for Star Wars. One of the best scenes in here is definitely Din Djarin catching Grogu like a football, though, proving that he is the best babysitter of all time, which I love that. The episode feels very rushed, as if there wasn't enough time to wrap up this show. Like, they got to the ending and they were like, oh crap, we got to put a lot more in here to just figure it all out, and it just didn't feel planned out very well. The one-on-one with Cad Bane and Boba Fett at the end is okay. There is a scene where Boba Fett's riding the Rancor once and for all. We all knew that was coming. It was very predictable, and it just feels like King Kong or something. I mean, it's wild. I think the most compelling moment of the finale is when Grogu does use the Force to protect Din. And by the way, these shields are very cool that they have in here. This is one credit I want to give the finale, the shields that are around these droids. And I like that the more that they go into the shields, they become red. I really like that. That red and blue color scheme used in Star Wars makes it feel all the more Star Wars. So I did dig that. But, you know, this whole thing just pretty much sets up Mandalorian Season 3, which I guess is why I'm revisiting it in a way, but still, it was just a very uncompelling finale and very underwhelming finale. The score by Joseph Shirley in the show is alright. I did find it to be a little odd, especially in, like, say, the scene where Fennec Shan was getting put back together and resurrected. They did bring back the Force theme for the Luke Skywalker episode, so I was very appreciative of that. And while I found Joseph Shirley's score to be kind of mediocre for the show, Ludwig Göransson's theme that he made for Book of Boba Fett is fantastic, and I really thought that was extremely catchy. It was great to hear before and after each episode. So overall, guys, the Book of Boba Fett is a mediocre show with some pretty big highlights, though. It has mostly lackluster cinematography, and it's missing that Star Wars charm that even some of the lesser Clone Wars episodes had, to be honest with you. I'm gonna give this show a might watch for sure. The last 3 episodes are definitely mandatory viewing, though, if you want to know what's going on for the Mandalorian Season 3. It definitely sets that up very well. And now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of the Book of Boba Fett. I'm very curious to get different opinions. Like I said, said, I think it's fine overall. So if you want to watch it, definitely watch it. If you like it, that's okay too. I'm sure some of you really love this show, and that's fine. All right, guys, I want to thank everybody for joining me, and I hope you continue to join me through this journey to prep for The Mandalorian Season 3 over the next few days. I'm very excited to go back through all the live action shows. And before I get out of here, please hit the like button below, subscribe to the channel, leave some feedback in the comment section, share this with your friends, and hit the bell for notifications. That's always much appreciated. Once again, I am Don Martino, and I will talk to you guys later.